Welcome to Noble Warrior. My name is CK Lin. This is where I interview entrepreneurs, practitioners about how they move from finite games to infinite games towards a life of greater purpose, joy, and success. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Tim Ringgold. He is a board certified music therapist. He is an author. He's a highly sought after international speaker. He's shared stages with luminaries like Tony Robbins. But today we're going to specifically talk about grief. Since 2007, he has been facilitating grief retreats. And I'm going to go deeper there. If you're interested in finding out more of his latest grief retreats, you can go to healmygriefretreat.com. Welcome to Noble Warrior, Tim.
Thanks for having me, CK. It's great to be here.
So, right before recording, we were making light of this topic. Grief normally is a very heavy, very, hush hush, let's not talk about it. And why I was excited to have you here is this. Coincidentally, a few of my friends or acquaintances have lost their mother, father, parents due to some kind of sudden discovery, right? So having witness and they're going through that journey with such dignity is a beautiful thing for me to watch. So I let me start off by saying why grief
Mm.
for Tim.
So for me, yeah, well, why grief for any of us, first of all, is that nobody gets out of being a human being without experiencing it.
Mhm.
There's three types of people out there. There's people who have grieved, people who are grieving, or people who will grieve. Because if you've loved and lost, you grieve. Grief is the feeling, the emotion that you experience when you lose a loved one or something you love. And so humans naturally bond and love each other as a social species, and which means, and since death toll is still holding at 100%, all of us beat each other back, to heaven or to wherever you decide someone goes, beyond the grave. And so at some point, we're all going to experience this journey of loss. And so it's a very normal, very natural, very universal, very human experience to have. And our culture is just terrible at preparing us for it. And my journey with it, it's almost like this path has been placed before me. My grief resume, sadly, is quite full, and it started at, like many people when you're young. I lost one of my grandparents when I was 11. My first, my first visit with grief, when my grandmother dies, my dog Lady. Now, for many people, pet loss is really intense for them. And what I can tell you, when I was 10, the dog we had, they got Lady before I was born. And so Lady was my sibling as far as I was concerned. She was my canine, big sister. And when she died, I experienced grief. It was very real for me. But it really got catapulted into a whole new world when I was 22, because when I was 22, my five best friends were murdered.
All at
And
the
I
same
went
time.
all at the same time.
Holy crap.
I went to five funerals in 4 days. I would get up, bury a friend, get as hammered as possible, pass out, wake back up, and have to do the whole thing over again the next day and the next day, and then two on Sunday. It was beyond anything I had ever, prepared for or had any idea how to handle. It's unlike anything I've ever experienced. Now, the grief of one person can be unlike anything you've ever experienced, much less the grief of five. My dad died 2 years later from cancer at a comparatively early age for a man, and I was 27. And listen, when I was young as a boy, none of my friends had lost a grandparent, so no one knew what to say. When my five best friends were murdered, like, who else has that in their locker? So no one knew what to say. When I was 27 and my dad died, none of my friends had lost a parent. No one knew what to say. And so each time I went through those experiences, no one really told me what to expect and no one said anything about it. And so I was just left with this giant ball of emotion that I didn't know was normal. I didn't know how to process it, and I didn't know who could relate. And then fast forward to 2010, and my wife and I, our second daughter is born with a very rare genetic disease, and she dies 17 months later. And so now I've lost my dad, I've lost my five best friends, I've lost my daughter. So I've lost in all the directions. And that was also a unique experience. And it wasn't that any of them were harder or easier or worse or better. People get very competitive with their suffering. You'll hear people say things like, "You think that's bad, dot dot dot," and then they one up each other. And
Wait. People have said that to you after you share your quote unquote grief resume. What? That doesn't make any sense.
so when like you go through something hard and someone's like, "You think that's bad? I had blah 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 blah," and they like one up you.
I,
Well, I've
I I
had
understand that under normal situations, but not
yes,
something
yeah,
like death is so,
yeah.
I don't
So
know,
people get
inelegant. So
that's a good word for it. Yes. And so people will suddenly talk about their grief
mm,
and like, oh, well, I blah, 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 blah. And I went through blah, 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 blah. And you're not sure where they're going with it.
mm,
Uh, and, people just they can say the strangest things
mm,
when you're grieving. And so one of the things I just realized along the way was like, I don't get to choose whether or not I'm going to lose a loved one.
mm,
I'm going to love people and I'm going to lose them along the way. And very quietly during this whole journey of going through all of this, I went to school to become a music therapist. And as a music therapy student, my mom, who was a retired therapist, she was facilitating a grief retreat. And she said, "Do you want to come on the retreat and do a segment on how music heals grief?" And I thought, that's really cool. I'd love to. That was in
You're
2007.
how old at the time?
35.
Got it. So you have had some life experiences already.
Yep.
Great.
Yep. And but my daughter hadn't been born or died yet. And so I start being a part of this retreat team. And twice a year, I'd go out to Scottsdale, Arizona and co facilitate this retreat with my mom and another retired therapist. It was lovely work, really God's work, just really serving others. And then my daughter dies 3 years later. And I take some time off from the grief retreat to go through my own grief. And it was really interesting because CK, while I was going through my grief journey, I could see my mom's slides from her presentations on the retreat, like as I was living them. And it gave me this roadmap for how to understand what I was going through that I didn't have the earlier times that I had gone through grief. And my healing from my daughter's death happened at a what people found to be an extraordinary rate. Because back around 2010, when my daughter died, you may remember there was this thing called blogs. Remember blogs, how they were like a big thing way back in the day? Well, I used to write a blog about my daughter because she had a rare disease and she was part of them trying to find a cure. No one in the blog, in the comments, could believe how well I was healing and how healthy my grief looked. And I realized it was just because someone had taught me a framework for how to walk through it, what to expect, what are the best practices. And so I was grateful that I had been invited on that retreat to help out because all of that helped me walk through my own journey 3 years later. And then after 2 years, I came back onto the team and kept leading and co-facilitating the retreats until COVID, when everything went away. And then my mentors retired. And after COVID, I made the decision, could I keep this going by myself? And I said, I think so. And so I held the next retreat by myself, and I found that I could hold that container. I didn't feel worn out or overwhelmed by it. My heart just grew to the number of people that were there. And I was like, wow, it's almost like I've been built and conditioned all the way along the way for this, to be able to provide this. And so for me today, now I'm 52 at the time of this recording, I feel built and ready to help more people in more ways than I have before, rather than just doing it on the side a couple of times a year. I'm now hosting half a dozen retreats over the course of the calendar, and it just feels great because I genuinely feel built for it.
Yeah, man, and it's funny how true the Steve Jobs, commencement speech saying it doesn't really make much sense looking forward, but you look backwards, you can see a through line, right?
Yes.
Who has had this many? Well, I mean, again, right? Using your terms, this amount of grief resume that you have had. I mean, I'm not being like funny about it, but like,
No, it's okay.
it's the experience you have had, and you had to gone through the experience and then learn, extract the lessons so that you can teach others, right? To me, I'm a purpose coach. The reason why I'm a purpose coach is not because I was, you know from the sky opens up and like, ta-da, you should be like, because I was lost. I had to figure out my own way, figure out my emotions, find the tools. So then when I now teach other about my tools, it's from a place of embodiment rather than some armchair theoretical thing that
That's
I
right.
read in a book somewhere, right? So,
Yes.
you are uniquely qualified to share. Here's the set of tools, the mindset, the practices to help people move through that very human yet intense experience of grief.
Yeah. Yeah. You nailed it. I tell people, like, this is not theory for me. And I think people, you, you, I'll speak for myself. I tend to appreciate learning from people who've done it.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean people who haven't done it can't teach it. But for me, like, I want to hear your struggles, and I want to hear exactly what were your obstacles along the
Hmm.
way. I don't want just the roadmap, because with every roadmap, there are obstacles. And oftentimes, what I find is people who haven't done it just teach the roadmap, but they didn't experience the obstacles. And
Yeah.
so, like, if you know what the obstacles are, you can tell people before they hit them. And
Okay,
I
so
think
that actually it's a great segue. I know that I interrupted you, but
no, that's okay.
it's a great segue to what are some of the known obstacles and
Yep.
also the unknown, the invisible, right? The one
Yep.
that's behind closed doors, the hidden ones that's so subtle or so sudden that, oh, I was so surprised when this thing came up, you know?
Yeah.
So are there
Yeah.
some of the obstacles that you can help people identify? Maybe,
Totally.
maybe for those who are going through the grieving process right now, a la some of my friends, they can say, you know what? I didn't think about that as an obstacle,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. 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 Well, there's so much to share. There's a couple of things that come to mind, and in oftentimes you'll hear it framed in the term of, like, myths. And, like, there's a myth, and people don't know it's a myth. They think it's the truth,
Mhm.
but it's a myth, and they hold it to be true, and therefore it is, and it shapes the way they experience their world. And one of the myths is that time heals all wounds. And so people think time heals grief. Time does not heal grief, it buries it. And so what happens is people get busy because our culture tells them you need to be productive. And if you're not productive, you're not useful. You're a problem if you're not productive. And so you need to get back to it and get back to work. And so people get busy and they bury and run from their grief because of its enormity. I understand. There's nothing like it. So it's just much easier to just get busy and run from it. But the problem is that it's always right under the surface. And then if any external trigger or internal trigger kind of trips it, it explodes and it comes out, and it comes out in all sorts of ways, whether it can be a physical manifestation of inflammation or disease. It can be a mental manifestation of a diagnosis of a mental health issue. It can be a social manifestation of withdrawal or isolation or social anxiety. And it can be a spiritual manifestation of a loss of connection. For many people, a loss of hope or a loss of belief in something they were holding on to before, and then they lost their faith in the midst of the pain they were going through, and they just tell themselves stories. And so, like,
Can I add
time
one
won't
more?
heal them. Yes,
Can I add one more?
yes, go.
Because what you have talked about is internal. There's also the relational.
Yeah,
Well, not knowing how to deal with that, so they lash out. Maybe not
yes.
wanting to, but nonetheless to their spouse or kids or employees or partners, and also make bad decisions because again, right, they're handling a lot of stuff internally. So these are some of the things that,
Nailed it.
yeah.
Yeah, no, those are spot on. Those happen, and people are operating on kind of like a emergency one half to one quarter of their normal capacity, their buffer, their focus, their physical energy, their cognitive abilities, and so they're trying to stay running in a top gear that their brain and body are like, no, we're in like power save mode right now, and but they just try to keep running and outrun that grief. And there's a great acronym that I want to pass on to your listeners, and it's called a STUG. And a STUG is a sudden temporary upsurge of grief.
Mm,
So you're going about your day. I'll give an example from my life. I was working in a physical therapy clinic. It was after my friends died. And there I was walking down the hall, and I'm just going about my day doing my job. And out of the blue, bam, the wave of emotion hits me. And suddenly I'm choking. I can't breathe. Tears are shooting out of my eyes. And I double over and stumble into a treatment room and have one hand on a treatment table while I'm trying to catch my breath while I'm crying. And 5 seconds earlier, I was like, what table do I need to clean? Where are the towels? And that's just a day with a stug. And people have these happen, and you can't predict them. They can come on for no reason at all, but they can also come on for like an external trigger, a sight. Like when I saw the billboard for the hospital my daughter had been in when I was driving down the freeway, suddenly bang, I'm back in the hospital, right? It can be a song can come on, your song. Like if my wife had passed away and Unforgettable by Nat King Cole came on, that's the song we danced to at our wedding. You better believe that that song is activating all those memories, and if there's any pain associated with those memories, it's coming out right then and there. It can be a smell, whether it's a perfume or a cologne or a food, right? All the sensory triggers that are out there. What that's showing you is that there's some unhealed grief. And you can heal that grief, but you first have to be willing to feel it, and you have to stop running from it. So time is not your ally. We have people who come on retreat whose loved one passed away 6 years prior to them coming on retreat, and they're still frozen in that feeling of grief because they've just been running from it the whole time. So that's the first thing to clear up for people, that time does not heal all wounds. It definitely doesn't heal grief. It just buries it.
are there obvious others? Let's do two more if
Mm.
you don't mind sharing. What are some of
Yeah.
the most misunderstood aspect of grief?
Another one that's really misunderstood, and I get a lot of flack. I get a lot of flack for this one,
Mm,
is that your grief is not your love.
mm,
Grief and love are related, but they're distinct. So your love is your love. Your grief is the feeling of the loss of your loved one.
mhm,
But as you feel those feelings of grief, over time, they lessen because you're designed to heal from grief so that the pain recedes, but the love remains. And what people do is they equate the pain and the love. And so they're afraid that if they stop grieving, they'll stop loving.
mhm.
And that's why people stay frozen in grief. They feel like they have to, because I mean, why would you want to stop loving your loved one? So
Mm.
they're like, well, I guess I have to feel this feeling because this is now how I honor my loved one, by feeling these feelings. And when I even suggest that humans are built to heal from grief and that you can have no more pain and have the love, people literally, no, that's wrong. That's not true. I don't believe it. And I'm like, well, I'm standing here living it. I know it to be true. I've witnessed it in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of participants over close to 20 years. This is what's possible. Now, I honor people's decision to hold on to their grief as a sign of their love. If that's their choice, that's their choice. But grief and love are two different things. And so you can heal your grief and the love remains and the memories remain. They just don't have any pain associated with them.
Now, I'm a guide, you're a guide, right? So we can point them towards what's possible.
Mm,
But obviously, you know, we're all sovereign beings. You know, they have their own agency. So if they
yes,
choose to still hold on to the pain as a way to honor their love, it's their choice, so to
it's their
speak. But
choice.
yeah,
Absolutely. It's
yeah,
just not required.
right.
And for some people, they're like, I'm not functioning well. I'd like to function well. I know I'm not well. I'd like to be well again, but I feel like I'm supposed to hold on to this thing, but I know it's not working for me. And so like, I wouldn't have healed as fast as I did if I didn't know it was possible to.
Hmm.
It was just that someone said, you can,
Hmm.
and it's up to you. And I was like, oh, what do I have to do? And they were like, just feel everything, really lean into the experience and just be very present to yourself the whole time. And the more you lean into the feelings and the more present you are, the faster the timeline. We don't know what the timeline is. It's different for everybody, but we just know it's faster the more you lean in. And we know it's slower the more you resist. And it was like, well, okay, I would like to move through these feelings as fast as is possible. So I'm going to really honor them. I'm really going to lean into them and I'm going to give myself permission to kind of put grieving as like my main job. I'm going to spend most of my day grieving. And so, like, I didn't work much, after my daughter died for quite a long period of time. I wrote about her, I grieved her, but I didn't like take my mind and put it on other things because I really wanted to honor that space because I had this idea that the more I honor it, the more I'm going to heal. And so that was my experience. And I was like, oh, okay. So what they said, it checked out.
Yeah. So I want to double click on what you just said about the time, but I also want to come back to the third misconception, right? But so we'll come
Mhm.
back to that in a moment. So on the practical level, again,
Yeah.
right, fresh in my mind, friends lost their loved ones, their mom, their dad, whoever. How long do you recommend them to just, hey, this is your main job for the
Yeah.
moment? Just grieve. Don't worry about, to go to work, trying to earn money or time management, or whatever, taking care of clients. Just focus on your main job. How long do you recommend? From
Yeah.
your hundreds and hundreds of people going through this process.
Yeah, so there is somewhat based on research, there is somewhat of a timeline for grief for most people, and I would call it like 90%.
Hmm.
And that timeline is anywhere from 6 months to a year.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of like a nice big window. Like your first 6 months, your second 6 months are probably going to, depending on the nature of the relationship, probably going to be harder than the first 6 months because the first few months you're actually in a state of shock and
Hmm.
you're not feeling everything you're going to feel and you're surrounded by social support. The
Hmm.
second 6 months is where the social support wanes because in our 24-hour news cycle, people literally forget that
Hmm.
you lost your loved one because they've moved on with everything else that's been blitzing their, brain on a daily basis.
Hmm.
And so that second 6 months is oftentimes for people harder than the first 6 months, depending on the nature of the connection. Different connections can have different trajectories. And then for about 10% of people, they have there's a couple of different names out there in the literature for it: prolonged grief disorder, complicated grief, where just the circumstances around the loss were a little more either traumatic or intense or entangled with other things. And that timeline can be longer, and it can be, that's the one where it can actually get stuck for a lot of people. And we don't say, well, that's going to be blank amount of time, because we just don't know for that
Yeah.
person. So, but that gives people at least just a rough general guideline of what to expect. Though the real thing that you're going to have to go through that's unique is the cycle of firsts. So the cycle of firsts is the first Christmas, or the first
Hmm.
wedding anniversary, or the first your birthday, or the first their birthday, or the first anniversary of their death. All those firsts, those occur differently than Tuesdays or Wednesdays, because you could
Hmm.
have 364 days, but then you haven't had a single anniversary of the person's death.
Hmm.
And so time does distort when it comes to holidays and anniversaries and special occasions. And so it's important to honor that those days aren't going to occur like any other day of the week,
Hmm.
and to have a plan.
Hmm.
Something, what are you going to do? You're going to honor that. You're going to mark the occasion in some, doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't need to involve anybody, but you're going to want to just acknowledge the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Right.
And as you do that over time, those days get easier, I promise you. And there are dates on the calendar that'll always be different for me. So April 18th, when my friends were murdered; October 22nd, when my dad died; October 11th, when my daughter died. Those will always be in my head. But I can tell you, as I heal my grief, those days hurt less and less with each, successive lap around the sun, if you will. So there's hope.
Thank you for that. That's beautifully articulated. Is there a third misconception of grief that you care to share, or top of mind, anything like that? This is not memory
Yeah.
test. I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
yeah, yeah. No, it's just kind of like what comes to mind that people should know is that, I think we talked about a little bit. So one thing that's important in our talk crazy culture is that the process of grief for each individual, it's a fluid process and it's unique to them.
Hmm.
So what works for your grief may or may not work for someone else's grief process. And two people will be grieving the same loved one differently.
Hmm.
You didn't have the same connection. You had your connection. So two siblings grieving a parent will grieve differently, not only because their own cathartic processes are different, but because they had different connections. And what we're grieving is the loss of that connection. And so it's unique to each person. So, comparison is the thief of joy, as they say. And another one is compare leads to despair. I love these little sayings, because you do not want to compare anyone else's grief to yours and make a judgment about whether or not someone should be grieving differently. Like a
Hmm.
talker will say, if you just talked about it more, I think you'd feel better.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, a non-talker, that's the last thing they need to do in their process.
Hmm.
And so there's lots of ways to heal your grief. Talking is but one of them. It's a great tool, but it's not the only tool in the toolkit. And sometimes it's flat out the wrong tool. So people make the mistake all the time of projecting their own grief process onto someone else, thinking about what would be good for them. And you don't really know what would be good for them unless you know them really well. And if you know they're a talker, let them talk. Like, you shut up and you just listen. You don't have to say anything. And I
Hmm.
think for a lot of people, they're so afraid to say the right thing. And I'm going to let you all off the hook right now. The real key, it's not in what you say. It's that you're listening. You don't have to say anything other than, I'm here. Thank you for telling me your story. And I love you. That's all your loved one needs from you when it comes to you opening your mouth. The rest of it is them opening their mouth. The process is for them to talk about it. If they're a talker, let them talk. There's some amount of times they have to tell their story before they kind of work it out. And clarity comes from communication. So for a lot of people, just being able to talk about their feelings kind of puts them into a container, and it makes sense out of them rather than, them swirling around in their head. You don't have to say anything. Your focused attention is the greatest gift you can give them.
Okay. So I'll come back to that. What kind of friend a loved one do in a moment? But I want
Yep.
to ask you this question because you had mentioned about, oh, how you personally have dealt with the loss of your daughter was very
Yeah.
healthy by those that read your blog, right? So what
Yep.
are some of the healthy and unhealthy, signs and symptoms
Mm.
of grieving that you can help elucidate?
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. So I run I run a retreat part one, and then I run a part two for people who have completed the first one. They come back and we do more work. And in that second one, we really dive into the difference between healthy and unhealthy behaviors. And I'm a sucker for acronyms. And so there's this great acronym called a STURB, which is a short term energy relieving behavior. And it's like, your nervous system, when it's stressed, it wants
Oh, wait,
relief.
what is the acronym and what does it stand for?
STURB, it's short term energy relieving behavior.
I see. Okay.
Something that scratches the itch in the moment to make you
Yeah.
feel better. And
Yeah.
it's your nervous system trying to self soothe.
Uh-huh.
When you're stressed, and grief is very stressful on the mind and the body, your nervous system wants to self soothe. So it will fire off ideas for what will make it feel better in the moment, because your nervous system doesn't care about later. It just cares about now. And so it's important to understand there's good now and good later. There's good now, bad later. And there's bad now, bad later. And there's bad now, good later when it comes to different behaviors we can do for ourselves. So I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that.
Yeah,
Good
please.
now, good later. Like, since we're talking about talking, having a heartfelt conversation with somebody and opening up about how things are going without being scolded or judged or told what to do or having the problem solved. That's really good now, and it's good later. There's no negative knock on effect of doing that behavior. Good now, bad later could be me going into my freezer and killing the Trader Joe's coconut ice cream. Like, oh, that feels really good going down, but that's really not supporting me later. I'm just filling my body full of sugar. And that sugar is giving me a hit to be like, dopamine. And I feel better in the moment. Good now, bad later. So there's lots of, good now, bad later behaviors. Um, so that's good now, good later, good now, bad later. Bad now, bad later. I mean, all kinds of things could go under that example. I would say for a lot of people, alcohol falls into that category because they get into fights now, or they get even more upset because it's a depressant. So it's bad. It's actually bad now. And then there's the repercussions from a hangover to the aftermath to the physical issues. So that's bad now, bad later. Bad now, good later might be taking a cold shower. Cold
Mhm.
showers. I hate 100% of the cold showers I take, and I've been taking them for 6 years.
Understood.
Not once have I looked forward to a cold shower, but
Yeah.
I take them because I know that it builds resilience for my nervous system. It's great for my immune system. It's great for my circulatory system. And it's great for my mental resilience to do things I don't want to do. If I do something I don't want to do first thing in the morning every day, I'm building that muscle of, sometimes in life as adults, we got to do things we don't want to do. And so now I've got a track record of being someone who says yes to doing things I don't want to do. So that's a bad now, good later. And so all kinds of different behaviors fall into those practices. So we can talk it out, we can work it out. Exercise. That's a healthy times two. We can journal where we write it out. Um, Again, clarity coming from communication, and now the communication is just you and the pen. We can play it out. whether you're playing a sport or you're playing a musical instrument, that's a great way to be in the moment, engaged in something in an embodied experience that's also expressive. We can pray it out, where we connect with some spiritual connection, some source that's outside of ourself. So there's all, and we can laugh it out. We can absolutely laugh it out. Listen, laughter is a coping skill. And there's this great phrase, which is, if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. And my wife and I have one, and ours is, someday we'll look back on this and laugh. So why
Mhm,
wait?
mhm, mhm, mhm. Okay, so, I have some pushback about
Yes.
the bad now, bad later.
Ooh.
Actually, no, the bad now, good later. So, the concept of hormesis, yeah?
Yes.
As in acute stress in the moment, but it's ultimately good, like a cold shower or
Yes.
sauna or, breath work,
Yes.
things like that. It's stressful temporarily, but ultimately produce a lot of good stuff for the body later on. Okay.
Yes.
So some people may say, right? Hey, you're sick, so therefore don't apply more stress to the body because you're just gonna make your body work harder to come out of the stress, right? Henceforth, the advice typically is, we feel sick, don't do the cold shower or the sauna or the cold
Yep.
plunge or whatever the thing, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
similarly, you had just mentioned when you're going through a grieving process, it's very hard for the mind, for
Mhm.
the heart, for the body even. So then do, do so some people may say, okay, great. I'm just gonna stop working out, stop going doing the cold shower, stop the so that I can chill out, so that I have the resources needed for my body, for my heart, for my psychology to heal.
Yeah.
Any comment on that?
I just wouldn't agree. I would say that's not a good idea. Actually, I'll tell you a great example of this.
Mm,
When my daughter died, I cried in the hospital room, and then I didn't cry again.
mhm,
So she died. I'm in the hospital room with her. My wife's with her. I'm crying, and then I didn't cry. I didn't cry at her funeral. I didn't cry at the memorial. We had a couple of different celebrations of life. There's a long story behind that. No tears. But I would go to the gym and get on the treadmill as a part of me taking care of my body,
mhm,
because the better my body works, the better my mind works, because they're two sides of the same coin.
mhm,
So I would go run, and I didn't feel like running, but I knew it was good for me. And every time I ran, I cried. I cried on the treadmill because I was moving all of that stuck energy that, as a man, I wasn't just letting out in other ways, but the physical movement of that energy produced the result of tears, which allowed me to express that emotion non-verbally. And I want to break down what I just said because it'll be useful. To express something just means to squeeze it out, press, express, right? And emotion is energy in motion in our body. Like, we think thoughts in our heads, but we feel feelings in our body, and they get buried and stuck in our body. And physical movement and low frequency, like energy, moves that energy. And so it was extremely cathartic for me. I didn't know that was going to happen. It was a total like mystery, like, wow, this is, but it would happen every time I would go run. So I would just pick the corner treadmill all the way over to the right. I'd run, I'd cry, but the beauty is, CK, I figured out tears and sweat look identical.
mm. I like that. That was great. Yeah. No, I love that. Actually, one of the phrases I say to my clients all the time, healing is moving energy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's
100.
yeah, it's the mechanism may be different, right? Maybe you would like to dance, maybe you like to sing, maybe you like to scream, maybe you like to shake, maybe drink
Yep.
ayahuasca, maybe whatever, right? Maybe you like to talk, maybe you like to
Yeah,
journal. These are just various way of moving energy.
that's
So
it.
I love
That's what we're doing.
what you said. That's great.
I appreciate that. And there's one thing about the retreat model that, just to tie in on this, why a retreat model is so useful for grief. The emotions that we experience during grief, for me, some of the most intense, deep emotions I've ever felt on this planet. And to you, it's like there's this conundrum because you can't really feel the intensity of them all at the same time. It's so overwhelming. So you definitely pack it down and to try to just put one foot in front of the other
Be functional. Yeah.
to be functional 100%. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you've kind of packed this energy into your body. And on a retreat, you pull off that road of life for several days and you allow yourself to mine the depths of that stuck energy and allow it to express in that safe setting because you've got the time, you've got the container. You've got a space container
You get
where
the
you're in the,
permission as well, other people are doing with you, you gotta
you've got the
support, you gotta coach.
psychological safety, the
Yeah,
social
yeah, yeah.
support.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes. So
yeah. It's
you're
normal
in
to
this.
do it versus in the middle of work.
Yes, it's
Not
yes, you
appropriate.
got it.
Yeah.
100%, right? Now going to like a grief support group is really valuable for a lot of people and I honor that and I think it's great. And going to see a therapist one-on-one also really valuable, honor that, really great. But in 1 hour, you just only have 60 minutes to dive so deep before you have to come back up to the surface because you've got to go pick up your kid from lacrosse.
Yep.
And so you can only get and touch so deep of an emotion. So that's why for me, the model of the retreat is the kicker as to why it works. And one of the best testimonials I ever got, someone wrote on one of the surveys, I healed more in one weekend than I did in a year of counseling. And it was like, sign me up to do this for the till the day I die because like if I can bear witness to that kind of healing that it's exponential instead of incremental and I think it just lends itself perfectly to this particular phenomenon.
I mean, you're speaking to another retreat organizer, so speaking to the choir,
Preaching to the
so to speak.
choir.
Yeah, yeah, I love it.
You get it.
I think there's for me, right? If I being just to um the retreat container as well as a coaching slash mastermind type of container, like peer group type container. I
Yep.
think it really is both because retreat you go super
Yes.
deep, you have some
Yep.
insights, some frameworks, some practices, the
Yep.
space and all that. You just excavate, right?
Yes.
And
Good
it's
word.
it's in the everyday that one practices to maintain
Integrate.
practice exactly right to integrate so that we can so for me it really is complementary. It's not this is better in my
Yes.
opinion. In my opinion, it really is both. You get the best of both worlds.
Yes. I think that's well said. And for me, developing what I'm looking at for my kind of my full expression of what my business looks like because I just made this transition from driving to a retreat center to facilitate for the church to taking this on for myself full time and holding this space for people. What I'm noticing is that really the best model is probably a year-long relationship that involves two retreats over the course over a six like one and then 6 months later another one and then on top of that a weekly some sort of touch point because what I hear from the people who go on my first retreat and they come back later on the second retreat like there's no structure in between and so they go on this super high roller coaster but then they don't have any like accountability. They've been given the tools, but no accountability or community. And so then they struggle to look for community and they try to organize it themselves. And since this is a retreat center that brings me in, I kind of don't get involved with it. I kind of leave that on their own, but I can see what's missing that really needs to be there. And it's like on the back end of the retreat, like we have an integration call as a part of the retreat. And then there's already a one-to-one like coaching model that I'm like ready to be like, yeah, this is what how we keep this going for you so that this just wasn't a really nice but exhausting weekend.
Hey man, I mean, consider what I just said. A little wink from the divine. Like, hey, if you want to do that, you gotta you got a
Yes.
little wink, a little nudge.
Yes. Yes. I
Yeah,
appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah. So okay, so let's come back to the practical tools, right? So
Yep.
what were some of because we mentioned a bunch already.
Yep.
What were some of the most unexpected? Like, wow, I didn't know I could do that to help me with my grieving process.
Yeah, for me, writing about my grief in a public setting
Oh,
what
why a public setting? That's really interesting. Why a
yeah, because
public
I
setting?
wouldn't have thought about this. Um, because of the social support and feedback loop, because humans are social animals, right? So it's not enough for me. It wasn't enough to just be able to organize my thoughts and just express them onto a keyboard. It was organize my thoughts, express them onto a keyboard, and then have other humans that I don't even know resonating with those
Mm,
words
mm,
and amplifying those words and talking about how that helped them and it gave them language to their own experience that they've had either 5 or 10 years ago that they didn't know how to put into words, but now I put it into words for me and they saw themselves in my words because we're all the same in a certain way, we're all different in a certain way, but we're also, also still humans having a human experience, and so they could relate in many ways to what I was going through, even though the details of our journeys were different. There's a huge universality to the grief journey. And so I didn't realize that me blogging was going to be so healing for me. And what I would do is so when Bella was in the ICU, she was in the ICU for 3 months. And every morning, well, so every night before I went to bed, I would write a daily update, how the day went. I'd go to bed, I'd wake up, and I'd walk to this park on the way to the hospital and I would read the comments from all around the world from the people who were already up and had already read the night before. And those comments gave me fuel for
mm,
that day.
mm.
And so each day I'd write the blog, I'd go to bed, I'd wake up, and there would be comments from the East Coast and from Europe and from Asia that had already read it. And those comments gave me the fuel to show up again.
That's beautiful.
And yeah, it was really, really, it was an extraordinary experience because they were mostly strangers.
Mm,
And yet we were having this very intimate conversation over the blogosphere, and people would say some of the most extraordinary things like, I've got my faith back.
mm,
And I mean, like, to have been part of someone's faith journey where it was broken and then it got healed because of something I wrote for me for my grief process. I mean, yes, please. So it's like so
yeah,
cool,
very,
like
very
what a,
fulfilling. Yeah.
what a beautiful, synchronicity. So yeah, that's been wildly surprising that kind of grieving in public
So okay,
was
so I have
helpful.
a let me. I agree with you. I love your personal experience. Let me cite Brene Brown a little bit.
Hmm.
She was an expert about
Please
vulnerability,
do.
and
She's amazing.
yeah, and then one of the principles that she shared in her TED talk, I believe, anyways, a principle that she mentioned is vulnerability is earned. So
Mm,
her perspective is, you know, um, the audience, whoever it is, needs to basically earn the privilege, the blessing of receiving your very intimate, private insights and moments. And she didn't say this, but I would, I assume I'm projecting. Um, what she says, something that's deeply personal, like a grieving, like a loss, and or maybe spiritual insights. I have my experience with God, etc., etc. So, yeah, gentle pushback, from Brene Brown. What do you say to that?
I'm not sure I understand what the pushback is. Can you try to say it again
her
for me?
her thing is don't make it public to people that hasn't earned your very privileged insights or moments or lessons.
Wow.
That's her thing. She basically said, share something that's truly personal, intimate, vulnerable, only with those that would essentially treasure it. Kind of like the Bible quote, right? Don't cast pearl in front of swines, so to speak. So
Got it.
yeah.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, you certainly avoid the trolls that way. You know, I can only speak from my own experience.
Hmm.
Like it may not have been the right thing to do. It was the thing I did, and I found it to be this wonderful synergy
Mhm.
of, oh, it worked for me and it seemed to work for a lot of people. And I definitely had people on the blog where there would be times where they took issue with what I was writing or they took issue with what I was saying.
Mhm.
And there, that did happen,
Mhm.
100. And that can happen from your family. You
Mhm.
know, like you can get scolded for living your truth by anyone you know or anyone you don't know. So I don't know how to qualify who earns that. I'm just a guy who's, for better or for worse, willing to go first
Yeah.
with my vulnerability, because I would push back to that. And the first thing I would say is, why would I expect anybody else to be vulnerable with me if I'm not willing to do it first?
Yeah.
So it's like it becomes this like, well, who's going to go first, Brene? Because if we're just going to sit here and be careful and keep our character armor up, I can appreciate that 100%. And yet, I think one of the reasons why so many people resonated with her TED talk was it was about vulnerability, and she was really vulnerable. And one of her calling cards is how vulnerable she is in all of her interviews and in all of her TED talks. And so I don't know. I mean, it's like
Got it. So there's a lot of paradox in what she
there's a
was
little
saying.
bit of a paradox in there. And you know, paradoxes can exist in this world, like
Yeah.
attracts like and opposites attract in chemistry. Both of those statements are true in chemistry. And so the world is full of paradoxes, and I'm okay with that. I truly do sit in that two truths can coexist and
Yeah.
not agree with each other. So if she yeah,
Beautifully said. And actually, that's something that I didn't think about. So I appreciate your bringing that point. She was very vulnerable. Her brand is vulnerability. And look at what she does, not what she says. I think that's kind of what I'm getting from this. Yeah.
yeah, I think she's been a huge gift to so many people because she demonstrated vulnerability in a very public, forward-facing, courageous way.
Mhm.
And I think she gave people permission to be vulnerable. She gave people courage to be
Mhm.
vulnerable, because it takes courage to be vulnerable, because people could use that against you. And I think that's one of the reasons as kids we learn to be very careful about our emotions, because oftentimes when we open up to others, it gets used against us. And then we're like, well, I can't trust that person. I can't trust opening up to people. I get burned. And she was a very public demonstration of what it's like to be vulnerable. And I'll speak for me, like some of the most people I respect in the world are people who have been very authentic and very vulnerable on stage about their humanness and their mistakes, not their successes. And they're the ones who have given me permission to encourage to do the same. And it seems like people really appreciate that. And so
Yeah.
I'll take the bumps and lumps when they come.
I mean, one of the people that we both know a mutual friend, or in my case, more of an acquaintance, but for you, more of a friend, is Joe Polish. And I remember he really left an impression on me when he introduced himself. Again, I don't want to share something that's personal to him, but he shared it in front of like 100 plus people. Hey, my
Yes.
name is Joe. I am a X. I'm an X. I'm an X. I was like, dude, the balls of this guy. He
Yes.
doesn't know us, and yet he's just like, kaboom! Here's who the skeleton, quote unquote.
Yes.
Typically
In
people
his
will high
closet.
about it, right?
Yep.
And then he was just like, "This is me."
Yep.
Like, okay, great.
He,
I like you already.
Joe is literally one of the people I was just thinking of when I said there are people who I've witnessed do this. Joe is a very close friend of mine, and our journeys in recovery, we went on that journey for years together, wondering when we'd feel safe enough to talk about that side of our life. And I watched him do it from stage. He's the one who modeled it for me. And then I saw how much it endeared him to everybody who met him. Like it was like I fell in love with him all over again. I remember being at one of his events that I was working at, and he's on stage and I'm texting him. I know he can't read the text, but I'm texting him, I love you more than ever, because he was sharing his story, and he was sharing parts of the story that I knew he hadn't shared publicly yet. And he was going for it. and he was swinging out even further outside of his comfort zone than he had before. And the love just got bigger. You could feel the love in the room expand.
So okay. So since you know him very well, and then I know that we're talking about someone else, he's not here.
Yes.
Nonetheless, you know him well. So, but I'm
Yes.
so curious because I would love to have him on the podcast and ask him this question personally. Because part of me is like, is that a shtick that he does, or is he
Mm,
really pushing that comfort zone ongoingly, just as a way to, well, grow, right?
I get it.
To foster that courage.
Yeah, I can answer that unequivocally. Yeah, because I watched it, and it's absolutely he's at the edge of his growth curve or the edge of his comfort zone. He's right there in the discomfort when he's sharing that. 100. Like that's authentic. He like Joe, he models this like as good as anybody I know. And someone I met through him is a guy named Tommy Rosen, who's also in recovery and has a very big platform online. And I've watched Tommy do it publicly, and I see the more you do it, the more comfortable you become in your own skin. And I've watched like Joe and I in 2010 talked about using voice changing software so we could have a podcast about recovery without disclosing who we were.
Mm,
We weren't ready. In
mm.
2010, neither of us were ready. By 2013, he starts saying it. By 2014, he's saying it on stage. By 2015, I'm saying it on stage because I've seen him say it on stage and he's still alive. Like no one took a pitchfork or a torch to him. And I'm like, oh, he's still here. Okay, I'm going to start swinging out and I'm going to start sharing more and more of my story. And then I meet another person named Nikki Myers, who's big in the recovery space. And when she introduces herself, she talks about all the warts and all the skeletons right out of the gate. And I'm like, no shame, no nervousness, just owning the completeness of who she is. Like she's a complete whole person, full of skeletons and full of all kinds of other good stuff too. Right. And so like watching other people learn how to first and take and swing out and try and be like, I'm going to be more vulnerable today than I was last time. Whew, here we go. And then they're still alive afterwards. You know what I mean? And you're like, oh, wow, okay. They
That's
did it. And
amazing.
it's like jumping off of the next highest cliff when you're cliff diving. You see your buddy cliff jump and you both, and then someone goes to a cliff a little higher and they jump and they survive. And you're like, oh, okay. Coast is clear. I guess I'll jump from there too. Here we go. Ah. And yeah, so Joe's the
I
real
love
deal.
that. I love that. Well, from me to you, appreciate your courage. It is definitely inspiring. And then actually, I would say one more thing that he said that really left an impression is we're as sick as our secrets.
Yes.
And I was like,
Yes.
fuck. He's so right. Yeah, fuck, dude. I want to, I'm all about freedom and purpose and joy. And it was like, fuck, man, like lean into it. It really is the only way out, right? Hiding it,
It's the only
denying
way
it,
out.
rejecting it, being angry about it, pretending you don't have it is
Yep.
just bullshit. So
100%. So here's what I want to say to that is for everybody listening to this, find either another human being or a group of human beings where you can talk about just the worst things you think you've ever done and you won't get scolded. Like find a space, whatever that looks like, whether that's hiring a therapist, whether it's being a part of a men's group or any kind of group. It doesn't have to be a men's group. We're two guys, so I'm thinking men's group. Find a place where you can talk about the things that you don't think you can talk about with anybody and not get scolded because you're a human being having a human experience. And I promise you, you're not the only one who's done what you've done, thought what you've thought, or felt what you felt. And in a very funny way, you're not that special. So that means you're not alone. And the only reason I can say this is because at my very first 12 step meeting, I sat in a room full of guys in a circle and they went in order and just talked about the most intense personal things that they were struggling with. And that guy over there talked about feelings he had that I had never told anybody I'd felt. That guy talked about things he thinks about, that he's preoccupied by, that he's distracted by, that he fantasizes about, that I do too. And I'd never told anybody that. And then this guy over here struggles with this very specific behavior related to pornography. that I struggled with that I'd never told anybody. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm surrounded by me. This is what it is to be a human. And so that was one of the greatest gifts. That was February 17th, 2003 in a church basement in Phoenix, Arizona. And that one meeting was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me because it taught me how the human experience is just this thing that we're all happening. It's all happening at the same time. And we're all doing our best to try to navigate it. And you don't have to navigate it alone. And you weren't built to. So don't bother. Just I lean on you, you lean on me, and we don't keep score. And that's how we get through it.
I love that. I love that public announcement. Yeah, I love that. That's amazing. So speaking of which, here's my segue.
All right.
Um, Let me ask the question. I'll give you a little context why I'm saying this. Okay.
Okay.
Actually, I'll give you the context first. So, a friend of mine lost his mother due to cancer. In the beginning, reaction was anger
Yes.
towards the mom, anger towards God, just
Sure.
complete anger, right?
Absolutely.
But after years of drinking ayahuasca and just had his own release, right? He's now on the other side. He now sees the loss of his mom due to cancer as a huge gift because
Mm.
without the cancer, he wouldn't have found this beautiful medicine, ayahuasca, and he wouldn't have gone into the spiritual path that he's on right now. So
Yeah.
he's now seeing the gift. Do
Yes.
you believe there's meaning, purpose, or even gift that can be found in grief?
Oh, it's an opportunity. Absolutely. Um, I don't think that I think that there's an unlimited possibility in grief that like I wouldn't want to even predict what's possible in grief. All I can say is that grief can be an incredible gift. Um, gosh, in so many ways, for so many reasons. And for each person, you get to decide if the gift's even worth looking for or like to believe that there's a gift inherent in it. Like you can decide whether or not that's even possible. I'm here to tell you the human brain can decide anything's possible. It's just framing like interpretation. So we look back on an event, humans do this automatically. We look on an event and we judge the event and we interpret the event in some way, most of the time unconsciously. But we can consciously look back at any prior event when we've had some time and space through the benefit of hindsight. We have a word for it. And we can actually choose and frame a context for that event of our choosing, that it can be neutral or it can be positive, and it can be what we call a blessing in disguise. And so we have a phrase for that in our language. It's just that we usually don't consciously apply that. In my grief retreat part 2, we go through a really powerful process where we consciously look at parts of our relationships with our loved ones that are still salty, that we're still incomplete about, that still feel negative, and we consciously reframe them into something that's either neutral or positive, because that's the gift of being a human being, is we get the last say on anything that's happened to us because we decide, we frame the interpretation after the fact. So you can look back at any past event through different lenses and see it differently and see it in a way that works for you. And I have to give credit where credit is due. I was at a landmark education event probably in 1998, and I think it was a Tuesday evening of the forum. And I'm a graduate. I'm a former introduction leader for Landmark. I love their
And,
stuff.
and so am I. Yeah.
All right, right on. All
Yeah.
right, so there I am. It's Tuesday evening, and we have to invent multiple interpretations of a problem we have. And the Landmark forum leader is like, okay, invent an interpretation that involves like the government, and then invent an interpretation that involves aliens, and then invent an interpretation that would be like a Disney movie. And he made us walk through like 7 different interpretations of the problem we were dealing with. And at the end of it, he was like, here's the rub. Pick the one that works for you because you're making it all up anyway.
Yeah.
So that's the gift of grief, is that you can find something in it if you want to where it supports you. and can be a blessing, that's absolutely there 100. And in fact, I just had the most powerful conversation today with another gentleman who had this distinction of when his father died. It was one of the most transformational experiences of his life. He told me, he goes, because I went from prince in my life to king. And I said, what? And he's like, well, my dad was the king. And so like I wasn't living that distinction. And then my dad dies and now there's no king in my life. I have to be, I'm assuming the throne. I'm 41 years old and I'm assuming the throne. And I just thought that was the most interesting frame to think through. He's like, my business doubled. I found the woman of my dreams. It was the greatest gift. My dad's death was the greatest gift to me. And I was like, that is beautiful that he can see that way, and that he was able to look at the experience through that lens and then grow in such an amazing way as a result. How cool is that? And he's like not BSing anybody. Like that's his dad died. This is true for him, And
Mhm.
I just thought, wow, from prince to king is like one of the most powerful ways I've thought about for men when they lose their dad. I was 25. I was very immature at 25. I was very much a boy still. And when my dad died, I was scared. I was a scared boy in a young man's body who did not know how to be a man and who definitely did not earn the right to be called Mr. Ringgold.
Yeah.
I, that was my dad,
Uh,
like I wasn't ready to be called Mr. Ringgold until not very recently. I'm just going to say, for my own emotional maturity, like owning that mantle, like I'm Mr. Ringgold now. Yeah, you better believe I'm Mr. Ringgold now. I own that shit. But like, there was a long time in which I wasn't ready to assume that mantle. And he said to me, he goes, gosh, wow, I'm so glad I was 41 when my dad died, because yeah, I wouldn't have been ready at 25. And suddenly we're realizing this like even bigger appreciation, for
mhm.
this journey. And, none of us can pick the time in which our friends come and go. And when my daughter died, I had a 4-year-old daughter at the time when my younger daughter died. So just imagine trying to explain life and death to a 4-year-old. They're very concrete. Right. And I said to her, I said, listen, these bodies, they're like rental cars. It's like a rental. It's a vehicle that takes your spirit through like life, through time, through space. And here's the thing. We never know. We never know when we have to turn it back in. Could be today.
Yeah.
Could be 70 years from now. But here's, unfortunately, Allie, Bella had to turn hers in today.
Mm. So speaking of that, since you usher or support others going well, number one, you've gone through it yourself multiple times. And number two, you're now the guide, right? Helping, supporting others who are going through this grieving process. How has your personal, spiritual, or existential outlook evolved over time? Facing all of these losses that you've seen personally as well as outside of you.
Well, how much time do we still have? Because that has been a absolute MMA fight. I got to tell you,
Yeah,
like,
let's hear it. Yeah, let's hear it.
woo, low, bro. Like, listen, one of the biggest things, I remember having a conversation with my dad early on while he was still here. And we were talking about like the justice and injustice of the world. And if there's an all knowing, all powerful God, how could that all knowing and all powerful God allow the horrible things that happen on this planet? And he said, yeah, Tim, he goes, it's in philosophy, it's this conundrum that everybody, this kind of existential fight that we all kind of wrestle with, which is why do bad things happen? That everybody, this kind of existential fight that's like you have to kind of like get into the ring with the God of your understanding and work that out for yourself, because there's no script for this, like, because there's no, how do you make sense out of the world we live in? It's too much. So when Bella died, um my while I was, every morning when I would go to the park and read the comments, I would say a prayer to God, and I would say, hold my fear I'm going to leave it with you so that I may walk into the intensive care unit with no fear. Like the village chief and his son in the beginning of Apocalypto. If anyone's ever seen Mel Gibson's movie Apocalypto, there's this amazing scene where they're out in the jungle and the village leader and his son encounter a displaced tribe who are traumatized, and the fear of and the trauma of the other tribe gets on the son. He's feeling the fear, and the dad looks at him and he goes, "Don't bring that back in the village." So every morning I would ask God to hold my fear so I wouldn't bring it into the hospital room, so that my daughter had me, because she's looking cues from her dad, emotional cues. Even though she's in a coma, I know that there's more going on. May I be pain-free? May I be fear-free so that I can talk to the doctors without emotion, so I can be like locked in. And I did this process every day. And I got to tell you, I was in the ICU for 100 days. And in those 100 days, CK, there was only one moment in 100 days where for about 2 seconds, I felt fear.
Mm.
That's it. 2 seconds in 100 days. It really, that space, that process, God held that space for me. And I was able to be in there fear free. But one day while I'm praying, before she dies, I get this download. He says in my ear, "I'm taking her home."
Mm. Your actual voice, you hear it.
Actual voice in my head. "I'm taking
Wow.
her home." And I
Mm.
say, "Motherfucker, what?"
How dare you?
Bro, what?
Um,
Bruh. All the things. And then it repeats, "I'm taking her home." It was as clear as my voice is right now. And I'm like, "Oh no. Oh no, you didn't. You didn't you didn't just send us across the country to discover this treatment center in Minnesota and have all these amazing things happen. You didn't have me write a blog and a book called Bella's Blessings, a humble story of providence in which I invoke that your hand is guiding this whole thing. And that book is published. You did not send us on this journey only to have me leave here without her. Fuck you." And he says, "Do you see the ants?" And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Look down. Do you see the ants?" And I look down and I'm sitting on a park bench, and CK, the park bench is next to a sidewalk. So the sidewalk stretches to my left, stretches to my right. And the sidewalk is concrete with like 10-foot sections. And
mm.
one of those little grooves in between the 10-foot sections is right between my feet. And in that groove, there's a highway of ants going back and forth in the groove. So I'm like, "Yeah, I see the ants." He says, "Are they in your reality?" "What do you mean?" "Well, if you stepped on them, would you be affecting their reality?" "Yes." "Okay, look up." So I look up, and I picked this park bench because I had a view of the downtown Minneapolis skyline from this park every morning. Beautiful spot. And he says, "Can they see what you see?" And I just look back down. "No." And he says, "My son, just because you can see what you think are my signs doesn't mean you understand my mind.
Mm.
You're not me." And I said, "That's fine. Fuck you. We're not talking."
Did you stop talking or praying or all that?
I stopped talking to him.
Mm.
I was like, "What the fuck do you want me to do?" Like I'm doing everything I know how to do. I'm turning this over to you on a daily basis, and you're going to pull the rug out from under us? Really? Really? That's your play in this? Like, you've set this whole thing up only to do that? Fuck you, dude. Who does that? What kind of, and this is biblical conversations. I mean, this is like Job. This is Jonah and the whale. I mean, this is shit that's been written about for millennia. This is the human experience. Like, what, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus says it on the cross as he dies.
Mm.
We all go through this moment where we're just like, bro, really? You're putting me through this? what kind of God does that? Like, what kind of God had me go to 5 funerals in 4 days? Like, what kind of God does that? So I've had these times where I've gotten punched in the mouth just so hard that I can't believe there's a God that would let that happen, because he either doesn't know everything, or he's not all powerful, or he's not all loving. Because if he was all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, why would he let that happen? That sucks. And so I was like, well, we're not talking. And he goes, I get it. It's fine. I'll be here when you're ready. And now, fast forward, after Bella dies, we're blessed enough to have another child. His name's Julian. And one day, Julian is on the floor in his bedroom having an absolute temper tantrum. I mean, on the floor meltdown, right? His nervous system is just blah. He is acting out. He doesn't know how to deal with whatever's going on. He is a hot mess on the floor. And as I'm looking at him, I can just feel God smiling at me, because I had all the time in the world as Julian's father for that temper tantrum. And I realized in that moment that temper tantrum had nothing to do with me. He's just figuring out life in this tiny little body, and I'll be here when he calms down. And then I realized that was exactly the way God was looking at me when I was swearing at him on that park bench. And I was like, okay, I guess we can talk again. But man, I have questions for you when this is all over.
Mm.
And so it's been like a journey of loss of faith, and then really humility, in that there's no way I could possibly understand everything that's happening. And faith isn't about understanding, that's understanding. And faith isn't about knowing, that's knowledge. Faith is when those two things fail. That's when faith begins. And like, that's the litmus test. So if anybody thinks they've got faith, like, go to the edge of your knowledge, go to the edge of your understanding, and step off the cliff. That's where your faith begins, where you don't know how to make sense out of this shit, where you realize you're a tiny ant on a fucking rock in cold, dark space, spinning around faster than you can even comprehend. You don't know your ass from your elbow. There is so much more going on beyond your capacity as this little tiny mammal to understand. I'm a 5'10" human in a human body. There's no way I can possibly grasp the enormity of what's happening. And so for me, faith has been side by side this journey of humility, of realizing what I can understand, what I can't. And if I choose to make sense out of things, I choose to make sense out of them. If I can't make sense out of things, those are the things I chalk up to God. And I say, you know what? This is how I've made sense out of it. I'm going to trust that I'm a part of a masterpiece that you can see. But to me, I'm just like a black speck of paint. I'm just this tiny little brushstroke. And right around me right now, it's just all black. But if I was to scan back all the way to the enormity of whatever you are, this entity that binds all things, from your perspective, it's a fucking masterpiece. And so when I can't make sense and I can't reframe things, then I just chalk it up to the maestro, the composer, the artist. And I go, all right, plenty of black around here right now. Just saying. A lot of black brushstrokes. Like, I'm feeling that way right now. I'm like, bro, like every day I go online and read the news and I'm like, woo, plenty of black brushstrokes. It's pretty dark out there, bro. Okay. If you say so. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's been my journey.
Thanks for sharing that. You are a master storyteller,
Oh, thanks.
and you really were dropping a lot of gems. For those who have the awareness. I think you, especially those of my friends who just literally lost their parent. And it's tough, right? It's very
It
easy to
is
it's very easy to question, you know,
100%.
all the things that you had mentioned, the
Yeah.
loving, the knowing, and then all powerful. What the fuck is this?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
What do you mean I have to eat my vegetables? Ah, it's just like, yes, yes, it's going to be okay. It's going to be
Yeah.
okay. One of the things I want to give permission to anyone who's listening to this to get mad at God.
Mm,
I want to give you permission to get mad at God. It's okay to get mad at God. God can take it.
mhm,
Um, Anger is a normal and natural response to a real or perceived injustice.
mhm,
And the loss of our parents is an injustice to us. And so it is appropriate to get angry. You can get angry. Sometimes we get angry at the medical system because we medicalize life and death so much. We get angry at anyone, anything, and there's degrees to it, from fury to just annoyance, and it's normal to feel that. It's natural to feel that. Don't feel guilty for feeling it. Feel it. Like really feel it. Let it out, let it rip. God can take it. And my thing is find healthy ways of expression. Take that energy out of your body. Don't pack it in. Whew, that's not a healthy energy to be trying to pack away somewhere in the tissues. And as Joe Polish has said before, the issues are in your tissues. So let it out, or else it's going to come back around sideways sometime later in some other way. So if you're mad, get mad. Like, I tell this story like on retreat, and you should see people. They're just like, "Holy shit, you swore at God?" I was like, "Hell yeah!" And they're like, "Whoa," like. But in all honesty, like, it's like, yeah, I'm a human having a human experience. What do I know? Like, I'm no different than my son. I'm just using English. He's just going but I have language to describe this. But my feelings are exactly the same. It's just misunderstanding of the moment. I don't understand. I'm mad. Make it better. Make it different. And so lean into that.
so let's start landing the plane if you don't mind.
Let's do
One
it.
of the questions that comes to me, right? I don't really know. Let's say again, bring back my friends who lost
Yep.
their parents just now. I
Yep.
don't know what to say. There's
Yeah.
nothing in my mind. There's nothing I could say that could ease their pain, their suffering in the for the moment, right? And the best thing I could do is I don't know what to say. Is there anything at all that I can be supportive? Is there anything that you need? And if you want someone to listen, happy to listen. Anyways, but I'm
That was
curious,
it.
is there
You did it.
any
That was it. That was it. Like, your friends need two types of people in their life right now. They need doers. They need people who can like help out with something. Can you do this for me? Yes, I'd love to. There's like right now in grief, their brains aren't working. They're not firing properly. So certain things are hard and like a task, and they just can't get to it. You could ease that burden by doing that thing for them that would seem like effortless to you, and it would be so appreciated by them. So your friends need things done. They may not want to ask for it, but it's an expression of your love for them. Like, listen, this is how I want to show my love. Let me bring you food. Let me do, like, take something to the laundry. Let me schedule the repair guy for you. Let me do something. And then there's people who are good beers, where, like you said, I can be here to listen if you need me. And you leave it at that. And I'll tell you, I've had people where I've said, I'm here. Feel free to vent. Feel free to reach out. I'm a good listener. And they never reached out. But later on, they came back to me and said, I just want you to know that I never took you up on it, but I never forgot it. And just knowing you were there made a difference. Wow. Cool.
yeah. Hey man, I mean, the thing that's guaranteed in life, we're born, we're gonna die. They're around those around us. As beautiful as this life is, they're gonna
Yep.
be they were born, they're gonna be gone one day.
Yep.
We don't know
Yep.
when. And for me, this is my personal anytime somebody lost someone, for me it's just a reminder how brief this life is. You blink 3
Absolutely.
times, you're 50, blink again, you're 80, if
Yes.
you're
It's so
lucky,
true.
right?
So true.
So how can we really like all the bullshit, all the little things, just like kinda like your son, right? Like, "Oh, I'm having a human moment. It's okay, but life is beautiful, and do my best to really enjoy it, to treasure it, because this type of interaction is beautiful. And thank you so
Yes.
much for being here and sharing your expertise, your journey, your wisdom. You're a noble warrior.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a juicy and delicious conversation. These are the kind of conversations I live for. So thanks for creating this opportunity.
Yeah. And for those that are interested, definitely go to
Yeah.
healmygriefretreat
Healmygriefretreat.com.
dot com.
Yep.
Yeah. So any
And
last
if you're,
words?
yeah, I would just say to anybody who's like considering it or like interested in that, on healmygriefretreat.com, there's a button where you can just schedule a call with me. I'm happy to support you in whatever stage you're in, whether it's you're not sure how to help somebody else or what you're going through. I'm happy to hop on a call with you. That's my gift. So anybody who goes to there, you can see there's a button that just says book a call. Listen, I'm here for you. So feel free to do that. Healmygriefretreat.com.
Amazing. Well, Tim, you're the real deal. Thanks so much once again.
Thanks, CK.